In 2022, the guns fell silent in northern Ethiopia. By then, entire villages lay empty, and the death toll from the Tigray War had climbed into the hundreds of thousands. It was a ceasefire born not of trust, but of exhaustion. Now, in 2025, satellite images show armored columns edging toward the Eritrean-Ethiopian border. Both governments call it precaution, the same line the world heard in 2020, months before the bloodshed began. In this video, we'll examine the military buildup, diplomatic breakdown, Red Sea stakes, and potential triggers for a new war. And to understand why the danger is mounting again, we first need to look at what the ceasefire actually left behind. The war that never really ended. When the ceasefire was signed in late 2022, official statements promised healing and rebuilding. But in Tigray's towns and villages, the changes were hard to find. One badly shelled road could cut entire communities off from markets and aid routes. In some places, power lines still lay in twisted heaps where they had fallen years earlier, never rest strong. The war had not just destroyed infrastructure, it had dismantled the systems people depended on to feed their families, reach a clinic, or send children to school. Fields lay untended after repeated planting seasons were lost. Livestock herds were decimated, and surviving farmers often found their land either mined, overgrown, or under the control of armed groups. Hunger bit deeper in the months after the guns fell silent. Aid convoys arrived sporadically, but routes were often blocked or delayed without explanation. Displacement remained extremely high after the truce, and in some districts it even grew. By April 2025, Shelter Cluster reporting documented around 760,000 internally displaced people still living in Tigray's displacement sites, many in overcrowded schools or makeshift shelters where disease spread easily. Humanitarian surveys continued to speak of staggering human loss. Estimates place casualties in the hundreds of thousands, commonly cited around 600,000, most of them civilians. A large share of these deaths came after the major fighting stopped, the result of disrupted food supplies, collapsed health services, and outbreaks in crowded camps. Rural clinics that had managed to operate during the war closed when medicines ran out. Malnutrition rates, particularly among children, rose sharply in some areas. In camp conditions marked by poor sanitation and scarce clean water, treatable diseases could move quickly and claim many lives before help arrived. The ceasefire itself left enormous problems unresolved. It sidestepped the issue of who controlled disputed territories, such as Western Tigray. Rival armed factions stayed in place, well-armed and unwilling to demobilize, while the political questions remained unanswered. Some militias rebranded as community defense forces, while retaining the same weapons and support networks as before. Eritrean troops formally withdrew, but their presence lingered through allied local groups stationed along key routes and strategic points. For many communities, life after the ceasefire was still shaped by militarization. Armed men were a daily sight in markets and on village roads. Curfews, sometimes unofficial, kept movement to a minimum after dark. Young men continued to disappear into the hills to join units training for a future fight. It was a tense, paused reality, conflict without the sound of war, yet still far from peace. Rebuilding proved nearly impossible on an empty foundation. Farmers lacked seeds, fertilizer, and tools. Prices for basic goods soared as inflation stripped away small reserves of savings. Desperate families sold jewelry, furniture, even corrugated roofing pulled from damaged houses, trading long-term security for short-term survival. As rural livelihoods collapsed, many people moved to already strained urban centers like Mekelle, driving rents higher and swelling the ranks of the unemployed. Much of the work available barely kept pace with the rising cost of bread and cooking oil. Humanitarian agencies worked under constant uncertainty. Access routes could be closed for security reasons with no notice or explanation. Local partners sometimes reported harassment or even detention. In highly contested areas, aid delivery required negotiations with more than one armed group, each demanding a cut of food or fuel before allowing trucks through. These delays meant some areas went months without organized distribution. The loss of schools deepened the crisis. In many rural areas, classrooms stood abandoned and buildings fell into disrepair. Teachers left for other regions or migrated abroad when their wages stopped, and children who had missed years of instruction during the war saw no clear path back. Schools had once been among the few communal spaces where children were safe. Without them, a stabilizing element of community life disappeared. The social fabric had also changed. Suspicion lingered between different communities, and travel along certain routes carried risks that went well beyond geography. Checkpoints could shift from one faction to another in a single afternoon. Markets that once linked different ethnic groups were hollowed out or gone completely. In this atmosphere, even rumors of troop movements could prompt hundreds to leave their homes overnight, carrying what they could. Observers who had been in the region before the 2020 outbreak noticed disturbing similarities. Commitments written into agreements were quietly undone in practice. Patrols visited villages known for political dissent to conduct security sweeps. Some local leaders publicly spoke of reconciliation while privately securing backing from outside military patrons. The patterns were familiar, as if the ground was being prepared again. By 2024, Ethiopian federal forces had steadily expanded their footprint in parts of Tigray, explaining it as a mission to combat organized crime and restore order. At the same time, Eritrean military movements, still formally denied, were visible to those watching the border regions. Reports of convoys and equipment transfers made their way into diplomatic dispatches and humanitarian briefings. To many, it signaled that the ceasefire was seen as temporary, a holding pattern until conditions favored renewed action. Political dialogue, such as it was, stalled repeatedly. Meetings were delayed, relocated, or canceled over disagreements about details. The most fundamental questions, governance of contested territories, political representation for Tigray, the status of armed groups, were no closer to being settled. Without inclusive talks, power rested not in negotiation, but in the willingness to hold territory by force. Displacement kept reshaping the map. People returning to their villages were sometimes met by armed men claiming the land and ordering them to leave. Others described quiet but persistent pressure to settle permanently in urban areas, abandoning their farms. Fields turned to scrub, irrigation channels blocked or broken, and knowledge of cultivation risks fading where younger generations grew up in camps instead of on the land. These conditions hardened over time into a new norm, a fragile stability held together by the fact that neither side had yet acted on its grievances. But under the surface, the region remained a patchwork of militarized space, unresolved disputes, and people living with the constant pressure of scarcity. The ceasefire prevented open battle. It did not dismantle the machinery of war or bring real security. The official language from Addis Ababa and Mekelle still spoke of reconciliation, but on the ground the reality was visible. Armed presence where civil authority should be, shuttered schools, aid-dependent camps, and roads that led to checkpoints instead of markets. The situation was not sliding back into war in a single dramatic moment. It was eroding slowly, with each unresolved issue deepening the cracks. By the opening months of 2025, the signals were impossible to miss. New military positions appeared near contested zones. Flows of weapons to local groups were reported by multiple monitoring organizations. Civil administration withdrew from frontline districts, leaving them under the direct sway of armed factions. None of this marked the outbreak of fighting, but all of it suggested that the next spark would have little trouble finding fuel. From there, the fault lines ran outward, and one of the most visible ran along the contested frontier. Borderlines drawn in blood. Along the rugged terrain of the Ethiopia-Eritrea frontier, the space between nations has shifted from uneasy calm to a fortified, heavily monitored edge. What passed for stability in the months after 2022 has, by early 2025, been replaced with steady military buildup. Armored units from both sides now operate close enough to engage each other with heavy weapons, their movement sustained and deliberate rather than the stop-start rhythms of routine drills. Satellite imagery and on-the-ground observer reports point to forward fortifications, entrenched artillery positions, and concentrations of heavier equipment within striking distance of the boundary. These are hardened, maintained field positions, not temporary encampments. The scale and permanence suggest weeks of labor, consistent resupply, and a logistical network capable of supporting operations deep in remote districts. This footage and testimony also capture the obvious strategic intent, forces placed to reduce mobilization time to virtually nothing. In such an environment, one misread radar contact, an unauthorized crossing, or a burst of gunfire could trigger escalation before national leaders have the chance to intervene. The new positioning shortens the gap between incident and retaliation from hours to minutes. Both governments present their activities in nearly identical language, describing them as routine security measures or scheduled training cycles. The tone matches their public statements in late 2020 when major deployments were similarly downplayed. Those movements, too, preceded sustained offensives. Residents familiar with those years read today's official reassurances as warning signs rather than comfort. Border towns have adapted to the shifted reality. Civilian travel is increasingly curtailed. Road links that once supported cross-border commerce are sealed by military checkpoints, and once neutral market hubs have been replaced by patrol bases and observation posts. New dirt tracks carved parallel to the dividing line allow armored vehicles to redeploy quickly along the frontier, erasing the slower pace that might once have allowed a dispute to be defused before weapons were drawn. The layout of the terrain shapes how each side prepares. Ethiopia's approach to the south is more open, favoring mechanized maneuvers but leaving large units exposed to aerial spotting. Eritrea's side is more rugged, with elevation offering natural cover and vantage points for surveillance. Ethiopian formations keep to widely spaced positions, ready to converge rapidly if ordered. Eritrean artillery and defensive units occupy high ground where a smaller number of weapons can control a broad arc. In some of the most exposed stretches, local civilians are no longer present at all. Humanitarian staff reporting from the region describe villages emptied either voluntarily or under military instruction, creating uninhabited belts that extend the distance between populated areas and active forces. These cleared zones reduce the chance of civilian witnesses to small-scale probes or clashes and increase the buffer for targeting. The shifting patterns of trade also reflect the prolonged military posture. Border district markets now sell goods in the bulk packaging suited for military field kitchens. Fuel drums, vehicle parts, and construction tools are more common than household items. Remote strips of land have been cleared for use by light aircraft and helicopters, investments unnecessary for short-term exercises but crucial for sustained operation. Supply depots, often hastily built but guarded in long shifts, are located within haulage distance of frontline units, ensuring immediate resupply if operations begin. Reconnaissance is unrelenting. Locals in both countries describe drones overhead almost daily, ranging from small quadcopters to larger unmanned aircraft. Flight paths trace likely access routes, pass over suspected fortifications, and sometimes provoke anti-air activity. Each close approach carries the risk of misjudgment, the spark that could ignite a faster, wider exchange. Analysts note that the quiet buildup is politically useful. Admitting a full war posture might invite mediation or international scrutiny that could interfere with strategic objectives. By continuing to frame deployments as ordinary, both Addis Ababa and Asmara expand their capabilities with minimal outside pressure. The gradual pace of reinforcement draws less foreign attention than a sudden surge, even if the result is the same, a frontier where neither side is more than minutes from battle readiness. There's a psychological cost to the soldiers themselves. Prolonged exposure to live boundaries and visible enemies heightens stress and sharpens hair-trigger responses. History in this region shows that repeated low-level clashes often begin with such tense proximity. Exchanges between patrols that spiral once heavier weapons are just a signal away. Discipline can erode under the constant expectation of contact. From a strategic view, the massing of forward units compresses early warning intervals dangerously. Within the reach of Ethiopian positions lie critical Eritrean coastal assets, including the port city of Assab, just 60 to 70 kilometers from parts of Ethiopia's Afar region identified by Crisis Group as a likely staging ground. Conversely, Eritrean forces are well placed to threaten major Ethiopian transport links in Tigray and Afar. Both sides know the other's targets, and both have drawn up plans that rely on striking quickly if hostilities break out. This concentration is not only about deterrence, it is also about messaging. The visible presence of armor, heavy guns, and well-supplied infantry near the border signals to domestic audiences that national sovereignty is being defended. Governments in both capitals use these visuals to reinforce narratives about looming threats and the need for readiness. As these signals are mirrored back across the divide, they are interpreted less as defensive posture and more as signs of offensive intent. Mid-level indicators all point in one direction: defensive lines that double as springboards for attack, constant aerial and ground surveillance, and infrastructure geared towards sustained engagement. The official language remains calm, even routine, but the physical changes to the border landscape point toward confrontation rather than long-term peacekeeping. What makes the situation more precarious is the absence of any real diplomatic bridge between the two capitals. Without serious dialogue, forward deployments are not balanced by lines of communication that could cool a flashpoint. Instead, each new movement or installation becomes one more weight on a scale already tipped toward conflict. Those watching closely understand that the military geography of the border in 2025 is the product of unresolved grievances, cautious probing, and calculated positioning. But the geography is only part of the story. Behind the walls of sandbags and the arcs of patrols lies a political shift that has brought former partners to the edge of direct confrontation, from allies to adversaries. In 2020, Addis Ababa and Asmara were on the same side of the battlefield. Their forces launched coordinated attacks into Tigray, exchanged intelligence, and divided operational zones. Eritrean troops pushed south through border towns while Ethiopian federal units advanced north from the heartland. The alliance was born of expediency, a shared determination to break the TPLF's political and military hold, and for a time, joint objectives outweighed underlying mistrust. The need for constant coordination kept the partnership functional, even if each side harbored doubts about the other's long-term intentions. That fragile alignment began to loosen after the Pretoria Agreement ended major hostilities in late 2022. The accord, negotiated between Ethiopia's federal government and Tigray's leadership with mediation from outside powers, did not include Eritrea as a signatory. Analysts point to this omission as a decisive turning point. By leaving Asmara out of a settlement that would reshape Tigray's political order, Ethiopian leaders signaled they were prepared to outline a post-war arrangement without Eritrean consent. Asmara read the exclusion as a deliberate move to limit its influence, while in Addis Ababa, the calculation was that including Eritrea risked prolonging negotiations and complicating the deal. The result was a peace framework that addressed one war, but planted the seeds of another rivalry. In the months following Pretoria, frictions emerged in ways that escaped much public notice. Eritrean officers reportedly complained of being frozen out of regional security consultations. Ethiopian officials were accused of dismantling remnants of Eritrea's wartime networks inside Tigray, particularly local militias that had maintained contact with Asmara. These measures fell short of open confrontation, but they marked a shift from necessity-driven cooperation to quiet competition for influence. By mid-2023, the rivalry had moved beyond policy positioning. Ethiopian agencies were reported to be extending discreet support to Eritrean opposition groups, particularly small coastal factions that had been dormant for years. Suddenly, these groups had funding for secure communications, access to training sites, and the means to travel abroad, changes Eritrean intelligence linked to Ethiopian sponsorship. Across the border, Ethiopia's internal security services accused Eritrea of supplying arms and other aid to armed groups in Ethiopia's Amhara region, where unrest frequently pulls federal forces away from the north. These alleged transfers, including foreign-supplied drones and other equipment, were denied by Asmara, but patterns in supply chains and the timing of flare UPS kept the accusations in circulation. Such moves drew the contest into the lives of border-adjacent communities. Influential local leaders found themselves courted by both capitals. Material incentives from vehicles and fuel to cash and promises of safe passage came with the expectation of loyalty. For farmers, traders, or elders in these zones, refusing either side risked suspicion, cutting into access to markets or healthcare. The narrow space for neutrality shrank further each month. Diplomatic contact deteriorated in parallel. Joint appearances and statements became rare. International mediators struggled to bring delegations from both countries into the same room, even for talks on technical matters like border maintenance or coordinated patrols. When such meetings did take place, they avoided broader strategic questions, leaving mutual suspicions unchecked. In Addis Ababa, policymakers concluded that Asmara would act to destabilize Ethiopia if it saw an opening. In Eritrea, Ethiopian military strengthening, especially its partnerships for arms and drone procurement with foreign states, was read as preparation for a direct challenge. This breakdown filtered into interactions along the frontier. Ethiopian units began to restrict Eritrean access to shared water points and grazing lands. Eritrean border guards increased inspections of Ethiopian vehicles, bringing cross-border trade far below its pre-war volumes. While these actions fell short of military engagement, they added daily irritants to an already strained relationship. Inside Tigray, groups once cooperating with both armies were pushed to choose allegiances. Feeding, arming, or sheltering the wrong fighters invited retaliation. In practice, the tension between neighboring states made local security more volatile. Factions began stockpiling supplies, shifting to more defensible positions, and forging new alliances, effectively hardening Tigray into a zone of proxy competition. The shift from battlefield allies to rivals echoed beyond their shared border. During the Tigray War, the United Front deterred outside actors from probing too deeply. Now their hostility created vacuum and opportunity, inviting the involvement of other states with an interest in ports, transport corridors, or military access in the Horn of Africa. Regional powers found their offers of investment, arms, or diplomatic backing more welcome under these divided conditions than when Ethiopia and Eritrea still coordinated security policy. For analysts, the exclusion of Eritrea from Pretoria was not just a procedural oversight, it was a moment that clarified each side's view of the other. Without a binding framework to manage post-war security, the relationship reverted to pre-alliance patterns, guarded, suspicious, and willing to use indirect means to weaken the other. The absence of trust was now reinforced by the presence of active measures, reported Ethiopian backing for exiled Eritrean factions, alleged Eritrean arms pipelines to Ethiopian insurgents. For civilians in the affected regions, the consequences were both immediate and grinding. Aid distribution points now face parallel inspection systems, slowing the delivery of food or medicine. Border towns saw trade dwindle. Markets shrank, and goods moved irregularly, often at inflated prices when they did arrive. Communities already destabilized by the previous war's displacement were drawn deeper into a new cycle of coercion, where affiliation could determine access to even basic services. Security observers describe these proxy engagements as corrosive precisely because they normalize hostility. A small clash, a disrupted supply route, or a targeted raid feeds into a series of grudges that grow harder to reverse. Military planners on both sides fold these incidents into broader threat assessments, justifying further reinforcement along the frontier. Neither side seems prepared to spend its political capital onto escalation when leverage can be gained through persistence. For Ethiopia's leadership, the standoff imposes a complex balancing act between confronting external pressure from the north and containing multiple insurgencies across its regions. For Eritrea, sustaining operations aimed at Ethiopia while guarding its limited coastline and managing internal affairs strains a far smaller state apparatus. Yet both capitals remain willing to shoulder these burdens if they weaken the other's strategic position. What has emerged is a rivalry with origins in alliance. The shared enemy that once kept channels open is gone, and the mistrust that alliance temporarily suppressed has reasserted itself. Pretoria may not have created the break, but in shutting Eritrea out, it accelerated it, leaving two neighbors to test each other through proxies, economic pressure, and forward deployments. The result is a political climate in which direct confrontation is no longer unthinkable, only a matter of timing and opportunity. And as each side measures the other's intentions through these adversarial moves, strategic ambitions further south along the frontier, ambitions tied to geography, ports, and the sea, are becoming impossible to ignore. The Red Sea prize. For Ethiopia's leadership, the fact of being landlocked is more than an economic constraint, is a strategic vulnerability that shapes much of its foreign and security policy. Since Eritrea's independence in 1993, Ethiopia has relied on access through its neighbors' ports to trade with the wider world. Today, nearly all of its maritime commerce runs through Djibouti. Ethiopian planners have long viewed this dependency as a critical risk. A single diplomatic rupture, blockade, or regional crisis could disrupt the flow of imports and exports that feed the country's economy and industry. Against this backdrop, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's repeated statements about restoring sea access do more than appeal to national pride. They outline an enduring strategic objective to establish a secure and direct route to the Red Sea that does not depend on the cooperation of other states. In these scenarios, one port appears repeatedly in policy and military discussions, a